Okay, and I think we're live. This is going to be a video about Surah 42, the Counsel, and it's very ironic. The title of this is very ironic because Muhammad's counsel was always faulty. It doesn't matter what he was giving advice about. It was almost inevitable. It was almost invariably wrong. It doesn't matter the context, whether it was dietary advice or scriptural advice, teaching people how to pray, how to worship God, teaching them how, basically teaching them anything. His advice was almost always wrong, even his military advice. And this was one of the most, you could say, successful parts of his life. His By the end of his life, much of the Arabian Peninsula had come under the domain of the Muslims, and they had succeeded in subduing most of the pagan Arab, or many of the pagan Arab tribes, but also succeeded in exterminating or expelling Jewish tribes like the Banu Nadir and the Banu Qurayza. So even in military terms, it was probably more useful than his advice in other contexts, but it was still pretty bad. So it's the title of this is actually quite ironic. So it begins with two verses that have the disjointed letters Ha Mim, the title of the last surah, and this is also like Ha Mim. This is a Meccan surah. Ain Sin Kaf. And of course, I don't understand what these mean, but even Muslims who speak perfect Arabic don't understand what they mean. And this is one of the features of the Quran, its incomprehensibility. There are things that don't really make sense, even when they're translated into clear words. But these are not clear words. In fact, they're called disjointed letters or disjointed words. Mukata'at would be the Arabic way of saying what these are, and Islamic scholars even today can't tell you what exactly they mean or why they're placed at the beginning of about a quarter of the surahs in the Quran. Thus does Allah the Mighty, the Wise, reveal to you, and thus He revealed to those who before you. He is what is in the heavens and what is in the earth, and He is the High and the Great. And this might be an allusion to the fact that Muhammad comes out of a culture which is somewhat similar to pantheism. The pagan tribes were very animistic in their relationship to God. They had a very naturalistic relationship to God. And as I pointed out in Ibn Warraq's book, Why I Am Not a Muslim, he explains this is one of the reasons why that Muhammad had so much trouble convincing them to follow Allah and follow Islam as he presented it to them, because they thought the idea of the resurrection was a joke. They thought when they died, they simply became part of the earth. And they had a very skeptical view of this idea of a general resurrection, your bodies being resurrected, just like the Greeks, the Epicureans, and the Stoics, who Paul conversed with in Acts 17. So in 6, we have another anti-Trinitarian argument. And as for those who take guardians before him, Allah watches over them, and you have not charge over them. The irony here is that this is contradicted by other parts of the Quran, which enjoin followers of Muhammad to persecute, to attack, to basically hound anyone who does not submit to Allah. So you have these two contradictory messages. In the Meccan surahs, you have a message of persecute of allowing people to remain mired, presumably in their ignorance, worshiping God, worshiping the triune God, or remaining Jewish. But in the Medinan surahs, you have this injunction to go out and to persecute people, to attack people. So in something like Surah 9, you have Muhammad exhorting people to persecute anyone who doesn't submit to Allah and anyone who doesn't confess Muhammad as the prophet of Allah. Whereas in the earlier surahs, you have a somewhat slightly more blasé attitude about it, saying, well, we'll leave this up to Allah. So here, where it says they are not, well, let me quote it. You have not charge over them, essentially relinquishing authority. This idea was, of course, abrogated, and this is why in most Muslim nations today, the official religion is Islam, and in many of them, you can be prosecuted, you can be imprisoned, and I believe in at least nine Muslim states, the crime for apostasy or the crime for apostasy is death. It's a capital offense. And in many Muslim nations, people who are not Muslims or who were Muslims and became followers of Jesus are either put to death by individuals, by gangs of Muslims, by clans, or they're sentenced to death, like Asha Bibi in Pakistan. Before thankfully they were able to bring her to Canada, but that's a common outcome, especially in countries that apply Sharia more rigorously, countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran, Pakistan. This is a very common occurrence, being sentenced to death. So it's a reflection that these countries adhere to the Quran, the later verses of the Quran, which stipulate that you should persecute someone until they either accept Islam or become subservient to Muslims by paying the jizya and basically withdrawing from public life, from public worship of the true God. Hi, Love and Light. Yeah, you might want to refresh. I'm not sure. I'm not having any problems so far. So as far as I know, when I do have problems on my end, I usually notice pretty quickly. But you could try doing that if you're having an issue. So in 7 it says, "And thus we have revealed to you an Arabic Quran that you may warn the mother city and those around it, and that you may give warning of the day of gathering together, wherein there is no doubt a party shall be in the garden and another party in the fire." And this is the recurring trope of the garden, which is transplanted in Islam into paradise, or their conception, Muhammad's very bizarre conception of heaven. He transposes this idea of a garden, this idyllic Eden, but it doesn't really resemble the Garden of Eden that's described in Genesis. The Garden of Eden in Genesis is a place where man had perfect communion with God. He was a caretaker. He and subsequent to him, his wife, Eve, they were caretakers of this land and they had a perfect relationship with God. Whereas in Islam, the garden or paradise is something that's basically a reflection of Muhammad's own perverse thoughts and ideas, and basically a kind of supercharged version of his time on earth with all of the carnality and all of the sin, only it's been laundered so that it's not sin. So even so in Islamic paradise, even though you're forbidden to drink wine and drink alcohol, in Islamic paradise you're allowed to do this. So you're allowed to indulge in all of the sins you committed on earth, and even those things which are prescribed in Islam. So it's not really a reflection of what life was like in the garden before the fall. And as I said, the idea of the fall is something that's completely absent from Islam. So it makes it problematic. The idea of having Muhammad or having any prophet or any apostle come and preach, evangelize, you have to ask yourself, what's the purpose of that? If there's no fall, if there's no separation between God and man, and if people are born perfectly, and that's what Muslims believe. They believe that there is no sin nature, so everyone is born a Muslim. And anyone who later in life converts to Islam, they're essentially reverting to their original state. And this is a really bizarre epistemology when you actually look at it, when you deconstruct it and try to understand what's the purpose of Muhammad. What's the purpose of Muhammad, or even the real prophets that preceded him, the prophets of the Bible, Elijah, Elisha? What was the purpose of Moses? What was the purpose of any of these people if the fall didn't happen and man was his connection with God was never severed? Then what's the purpose of preaching the gospel, or Muhammad's version of the gospel, which would be the Quran? So there's also, and I went over in the last video the idea of the Arabic Quran, how problematic that is. The idea that God can only communicate to people in one language, much less an obscure language, which only a very small portion of the global population, these nomadic tribesmen and herdsmen spoke, and who were very insignificant. If you actually look at the Bible, even though Arabia, they do get preaching, and Isaiah the prophet was basically preached to the entire Middle East, but they're not that significant in terms of the overall picture. So why would God need to have a new revelation imprinted on imprinted with the Arabic language? Why was Arabic so important? And also, why give this message in any other language if it's necessary to understand Arabic? What's the point of having dawah in English or in what's the point of having dawah in any language other than Arabic if you can only understand the message of the Quran in Arabic? And I also pointed out the fact that Arabic itself was a nascent language at this point. So the Arabic that people are reading the Quran in today, even if you're lucky enough to speak and read Arabic, you're not reading the Arabic of Muhammad's day. Just like if you're a Greek speaker, if you're in Greece or Cyprus and you speak Greek today, you're not speaking the same language that the apostles spoke, or that the Romans, in the Bible spoke. You're not speaking the same language that the New Testament was written in, which is Koine Greek. So these people who claim that the English translation of the Quran is an inferior product or doesn't convey the message of the Quran, they have to reconcile themselves to the fact that even their Arabic Quran is not a perfect Arabic Quran because it's not written in the Arabic language that Muhammad used. So in 8, it says, and if Allah had pleased, he would surely have made them a single community, but he makes whom he pleases enter into his mercy, and the unjust it is that shall have no guardian or helper, or have they taken guardians besides him, but Allah is the guardian, he gives life to the dead, and he has power over all things. And just a side note, he says this, but in the Quran, it says that Allah cannot heal blind people, cannot make the blind to see. And in that context, he's speaking metaphorically about people who reject Islam, but it also has a literal application because Muhammad, and we'll get to this surah eventually, Muhammad was bothered by a man who was deaf, or blind rather, and he thought he was a nuisance. He couldn't do anything to help him, whereas Jesus actually healed people of their blindness. In the Gospel of Mark, he unstops a deaf man's ears, and he personally touches him and heals him of his lifelong deafness so that he can hear. So Jesus actually does help the deaf to hear and the blind to see, but this is something that's impossible for Allah, and certainly not possible for his prophet Muhammad. But something else interesting in verse 8, where it says Allah would have made them a single community. This is essentially him not acknowledging that language differences are a result of and here I'll go to Genesis 8 when it says, and the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain, the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said to one another, go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and slime that had they for mortar. And they said, go to, let us build a city and a tower, whose top may reach into heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth. And from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of the earth. Now there are a number of points to be drawn from that. One of them being the fact that God is not a unitary God, that he's one God, but that he's comprised of more than one person. But also, this is something that Muhammad implicitly rejects, this idea that mankind was able to communicate with one another at one point. He basically implies that all of these separate ethno-linguistic groups, all of these languages existed simultaneously. So, and it's kind of interesting because in the last surah, I mentioned the fact that he combines the idea, one of the central ideas from Genesis 11, and combines it into the story of the Exodus and the conversation between Pharaoh and Moses. So he conflates all of these different biblical narratives and combines them into one story. And here he's essentially discounting Genesis 11 altogether. And it's interesting because Muslims, they'll attack the Bible even though Muhammad repeatedly affirms the Torah and the Injil, the Torah and the Gospel, despite the fact that he himself rejects, like in this passage, he rejects huge swaths of the Bible, of the Old Testament, and of course the New Testament. He rejects the central message, the central idea of the Bible itself, which is that Jesus is Lord, and he came to earth as a sacrifice. So he completely rejects that, even though in the same book at other points he's affirming it. So here you have him basically claiming that Genesis 11 is not truthful. But then he just segues into another anti-Trinitarian argument. So in 10, it says, "And in whatever thing you disagree, the judgment thereof is in Allah's hands. That is Allah, my Lord. On him do I rely, and to him do I turn time after time. The originator of the heavens and the earth. He made mates for you from among yourselves, and mates of the cattle too, multiplying you thereby. Nothing like a likeness of him, and he is the hearing, the seeing." And in 13, it says, "He has made plain to you the religion that he enjoined upon Noah, i.e. Noah, and that which we have revealed to you, and that which we enjoined upon Abraham and Musa and Isa, that keep to obedience and be not divided therein. Hard to the unbelievers is that which you call them to. Allah chooses for himself whom he pleases, and guides to himself who turns to him frequently." So again, in the very same surah, a few verses after he's completely rejected part of the Bible, part of Scripture, he says this is the same thing that was taught to, or that was given to Ibrahim, i.e. Abraham, and Musa and Isa, the Muslim version of Jesus. So even within a few paragraphs, he's contradicting himself, and the Quran is refuting itself, saying, well, you can't trust this part of the Bible, even though it's been preserved. We still read it. It's still part of Genesis. You can't trust that, but trust me when I say I'm in the same vein as Abraham and Moses and Jesus, and I'm just another one of the prophets. It doesn't make any sense when you really stop and look at this critically. So in 15, it says, "To this then go on inviting, and go on steadfastly on the right way as you are commanded, and do not follow their low desires." And again, this contradicts the fourth verse where I'm sorry, it contradicts an earlier verse which says, don't bother people who have rejected Islam. So here it says you should go on proselytizing, inviting people to Islam, even after earlier in the surah it says, these people will be dealt with by Allah. So again, it's just riddled with contradictions. So it says, "We shall have our deeds and you shall have your deeds. No plea need there be now between us and you. Allah will gather us together, and to him is the return." So again, he returns to this theme of Allah deciding who's going to be chosen. And another point is this just reiterates the focus, the emphasis Islam has on a works-based soteriology. It's not whether or not, even though you're enjoined to believe in Allah and his prophet, here the determination, the judgment is going to come down to what deeds you have performed. So if you're a Muslim, you're going to be you're going to be tasked with explaining what deeds you perform for Allah. And if you're a Christian or Jew, you're going to be also judged by your deeds. So in 16 it says, and as for those who dispute about Allah after their obedience has been rendered to him, their plea is no with their Lord, and upon them is wrath, and for them is severe punishment. Those who do not believe in it would hasten it on, and those who believe are in fear from it, and they know that is the truth. Now most surely those who dispute obstinately concerning the hour are in great error. And this is another recurring theme of the Quran, the idea that people who are going to be judged, who have rejected Islam, want to hasten the judgment, which doesn't make a lot of sense logically, but this is something that's repeated throughout the Quran. So in 19 it says, Allah is benignant to his servants. He gives sustenance to whom he pleases, and he is the strong and mighty. And this is something that's really interesting because it says Allah. So Allah is supposed to be a helper for people who are Muslims, people who follow Muhammad and who worship in the way that he does. Yet Muhammad himself died a slow, miserable death over the course of 3 years. He was poisoned by, and most of you probably already know this story, he was poisoned by Zainab bint al-Harith, who was a Jewish woman that after her husband had been killed in the Battle of Khaybar, which ended in the decapitation and slaughter of hundreds of Jewish tribesmen whom Muhammad captured. After her husband was killed and she was enslaved, she fed Muhammad a poisoned lamb. And there are a number of interesting things about the story, but the main takeaway from this story, which is confirmed not only in the Quran itself, but also by the tafsir and the hadith. And I'll just briefly read from the verse in the Quran where this is confirmed, or not so much that this incident is confirmed, but the interpretation of what this means. So she served him a poisoned lamb after he captured her and killed her husband in this battle. He lingered on for about 2 or 3 years and died a miserable death. And there is a hadith in Sahih Muslim. Muhammad claimed that he couldn't be killed, and this was one of the reasons he didn't punish this woman, because his followers asked him if they wanted if he wanted her killed, just like they did with other people. He killed poets and musicians and people who criticized him publicly. He had them murdered. He had his cronies, his cronies go in and kill them. And they asked if he wanted he wanted this woman killed, since she poisoned him. And he said no. And the reason he said no was because he believed that he could not be killed. In Sahih Muslim 265430, he claims that he could not be killed, and this was the reason that he didn't have her punished for poisoning him. So this is something that's in the Quran as well. So you go down to verse 41, and it says, and it is not the word of a poet. And Muhammad plagiarized from Arab poetry. Christian Prince actually did a video about this. Little is it that you believe, nor the word of a soothsayer. Little is it that you mind. It is a revelation from the Lord of the worlds. And if he had fabricated against us some of the sayings, we would certainly have seized him by the right hand. Then we would certainly have cut off his aorta. and not one of you could have withheld us from him. So in this verse, he's saying that if he's basically saying if he was a false prophet, his aorta would be severed and he would die as a result. And this is exactly what happened to Muhammad. So in a way, this was one of the only prophecies that Muhammad actually successfully fulfilled. Ironically, that of him being a false prophet. And this was something that Zainab bint al-Harith tested. She wanted to see if he really was a prophet. And of course, the fact that he died almost 3 years later proved that he was a false prophet, because this was one of the few prophecies that he actually successfully fulfilled. And there are a number of things to be drawn from this. The key point being that the Quran is just a series of just willful misinterpretations and lies, and it's not created. It wasn't created by God, because this verse 19, that Allah is benignant to his servants, is contradicted by the fact that Muhammad died a miserable death that proved that he himself alluded to as being worthy of a false prophet. So obviously Allah had some enmity towards Muhammad if he would embarrass him in this way, in the same way that the false teacher Arius had in a very gruesome way, had his intestines fall out of him as he was trying to find somewhere to relieve himself. This is something that Lars Brownworth recounts in his book Lost to the West: A History of the Byzantine Empire. So in order to expose the fact that this guy was an incredibly wicked false prophet, this is the manner in which he died. And it demonstrates that the Quran is false just by the way that Muhammad died. But also, it raises a good point, because a lot of Muslims, and this is something emphasized in the Quran, will claim that someone suffering some sort of disease, someone dying, someone being afflicted in some way is a result of God being displeased with him. Now, if they had actually read the Bible, if they had read Job, they would understand that this is not the case. Just because you're afflicted, that doesn't mean God hates you or that God has some kind of grudge against you. And the fact that you die prematurely, it has nothing to do with that. Everyone dies. Everyone dies at one point. It's not a reflection of God's displeasure, and Muslims would know that if they read the Bible. But even if you believe that this is accurate, that diseases or illnesses or death, that's something that's a reflection of God's enmity towards the person, then even by that standard, Islam would be proven to be false, because Muhammad died. Literally, he died in agony, and he died the death of a false prophet, just like the death of Abu Laban. When Nabil Qureshi died, all of these Dawa Chanos and these stupid Islamic apologists were crowing over the fact that he died and saying he was punished by Allah, and that this was a curse sent on him because he converted. He rejected Islam. But if you're going to use this sort of warped logic, then you would have to apply it consistently. So Abu Laban was the imam, the one who essentially created the Jillen's Poston global crisis. For those of you who remember the Jillen's Poston Mohammed cartoons, they were a series of relatively benign cartoons, one of the most famous being the caricature of Muhammad with a, a time bomb inside of his turban, and about 9 or 10 other cartoons that were published in Jyllands Posten, the Danish newspaper, and then republished. Kurt Westergaard and Fleming Rose, rather, was associated with this, and he had to go into hiding and erect a concrete barrier beneath his home so that he wouldn't be murdered by Muslims offended by these cartoons. And it led to a number of deaths, mostly of Muslims who were rioting in places like Pakistan. But Abu Laban was the imam who took these, which had been published without much fanfare and didn't attract much notice. So he took these cartoons, which had already been published and not really attracted a lot of attention, and went on a foreign junket, basically, where he would go to places like Iran or Pakistan and show them to leaders there and have them published and basically broadcast, not published, but have the news of this broadcast throughout the Middle East and Central Asia and places like Pakistan, so that he would inflame an already very easily triggered Ummah into revolt and riot, and forcing international organizations like the United Nations to pressure Western countries into adopting anti-blasphemy laws, which would prohibit the publication of these types of cartoons, which are protected by freedom of speech in most of Europe and the United States. So Abu Laban was the imam who did this. He went around with these cartoons and even added ones so that he could increase the fervor. Well, what happened to Abu Laban? He died of cancer less than a year later. So Allah obviously was not pleased with him. If he was not pleased with him if he took him and struck him with cancer, and one of the most agonizing cancers, and he died within a year. He didn't even wait. Within almost immediately after he did this, he got struck down by Allah. So if you're going to use this as, if you're going to have this very bizarre theology where people suffer because of what they suffer physical ailments because of what they believe, then you would have to apply this consistently and apply it to Islam and to people like Abu Laban, who was a fanatical Muslim who used lies and deceit in order to inflame tensions and to advance Islam. So obviously Allah was not pleased with this guy, because he killed him like within a year. I mean, Nabil Qureshi actually, or less than a year, Nabil Qureshi suffered, but he was able to spread the gospel, continue his ministry, and leave this rich, lasting legacy, much more so than this guy, who was mourned by a couple thousand Muslim fanatics, but otherwise is largely forgotten, even within the context of that controversy. So I just wanted to bring up that point, and that's about halfway through the surah. I just wanted to focus to end on that point, because I think it's important, because this is one of the pernicious myths spread by Islam, and these are people that just don't understand that affliction and suffering, they're not related to whether or not they're not related to someone's spiritual state. Whether someone gets a disease or someone contracts an illness, that's not because they did something to sin. Like Jesus says, when his disciples asked him, this man who's afflicted, who sinned, he or his parents, and he says neither. And he tells them that he's going to use this as an example to demonstrate the glory of God, to heal him. It's the same thing when people approach Jesus and tell him about Pilate mixing the blood of Jews who are worshiping in the temple, mixing it, their sacrifice, and killing them. And he asked them if they think that these people are greater sinners, or the people who died in the collapse of the Tower of Siloam, are they greater sinners? And he says, he basically answers his own question. He says, no, they're not. They're they died, but unless you repent, you're going to be in the same place as them. So I just want to finish with that point. I'll finish the surah hopefully in my next video. And thanks everyone who came. Enzo, Love and Light, Correns, all of the regulars, and the new mods, GW. I hope you enjoyed it and got something from this. And I'll see you next time.